Chapter 3, the Golden Age, military air power developments during the inter-year wars. So this is now how the military developed pretty much after World War I up until just prior to World War II. Um, and what they were doing during that age of the barnstorming and how commercial aviation started to arise. And you saw at the very end of the last one where the military decided to buy some of the DC-3s and turn them into C-47s for their military purposes. So this is how the military started to foresee how they were going to work with aviation in their arena and go from there. So with that, we go to kind of getting into what the national policy regarding military aviation was at the time. And it was basically what was thought was that the airplane was primarily a defensive weapon. It was going to be used to defend the coasts from attacks and things like that. So that was what their plan was of that, to protect the United States, continental United States area. And so they were going to fly basically coastal routes protecting the land. Now, that was the national policy. The Army Air Corps officers, the people that were part of the tail end of the war and part of the Air Force at the end of World War I, they had different thoughts. They understood that there was a positive potential for offensive use of the airplane. They saw that this could be used as a weapon and not a defensive item. Okay. They also looked at, they were also starting to make some small progresses towards developing fighters and bombers. So what we did see in the past, kind of like the lack of planning that the United States had going into wars and going into certain things, you kind of see that there is the idea among a certain group that we need to plan, we need to plan, we need to plan, but you're going to also see that they did still have that lack of foresight about what we should do and things like that. But they did make some small progress in aviation in the military. One of the things that we saw here when commercial aviation was expanding is that Boeing created the 247. And after the DC-3 was built, the 247 basically became kind of obsolete. And Boeing started to falter a little bit, or they weren't making as many planes, and they didn't have the big contract that they had at one point in time. Now, the United States government and military, mainly the air commanders and things like that of the United States Air Corps, they set out, we need to make a multi-engine bomber. So this allowed Boeing, being as how they didn't have much going on with the DC-3 taking over what they were doing, allowed them to respond to the Army's design competition for that bomber. And there were certain requirements that they wanted to do, but the main thing was a multi-engine bomber that was the key. And at this time, everything that was multi-engine currently always meant two engines. What the military was looking for is they wanted something a little bit better, so Army wanted four engines. They wanted to go with four engines on their airplane, and that's what they meant by a multi-engine bomber. And they told this to Boeing: if you're going to build something, and you're going to do it, go with at least four engines. Okay, go with four engines. So, and there were other corporations that were also in a competition to build these bombers, and they went into production mode and design mode. And in July 28th, 1935, the Boeing Model 299 made its first test flight. And as you can see, it has four engines. It has two on this side and it has two on the other side. And a big monoplane, low-winged airplane. Okay, so this is the Model 299. This is the first test flight, 1935. So in its test flight, there were two other, like I said, two other companies that were competing for this contract, and the Boeing 299 outperformed both of these other aircraft, or both these other companies that the aircraft put forth. Okay, matter of fact, it was able to outfly any fighter airplane that was currently in the United States military. This airplane was very well made and very advanced for its time and for what we had at the time. The Army was so impressed that they decided to order 52 of these. Now, again, national security purposes or national purposes said this is for defense of the homeland or defense of the continental United States. The Army, the officers kind of were thinking some other stuff with this, but it satisfied the contract for both, really the national security and the what the Army officers wanted. But basically, what they were creating was the first long-range bomber. And when we mean long range, it would go a great distance. So, and this was capable of like the distances the commercial airlines or airplanes are flying in even farther. Okay. Um, on October 30th, 1935, however, the 299 during the test flights crashed because it did not, or the crew did not remove the gust locks before takeoff. Now, what that is the gust locks. If you take a look at the tail section here, which just happens to be, this is the 299 after the crash, and here's the tail. This striped piece right here, that's the rudder. Okay, and the rudder moves left or right and guides the plane so that you can swing the tail left or right. Gust locks were pieces that were put on here, that this is the solid part of the airplane, and what they were doing was they were put between the rudder and the solid part and run through there so that when the plane is sitting on the tarmac outside, the wind doesn't catch the rudder and just swing the rudder back and forth and really kind of overwork the rudder like it shouldn't do. So the gust lock basically locks the rudder in place. The crew, before it took off, forgot to remove those gust locks. So once the airplane got in the air, it couldn't control the direction that the airplane was flying, and it basically crashed. So it was actually pilot error that made the airplane crash. It was not a fault of the airplane itself. So the forgetting of removing the gust locks led to the creation of a pre-flight checklist. And if you've watched movies before or anything like that, and you watched an airplane movie where they talk, they're going in there and they're going, okay, go ahead and check this, and the co-pilot goes check or on or off, whatever like that. Well, that's what this is. So if you take a look at this here, like pilot's pre-flight, okay, this means the pilot has to walk around the entire plane, checking all the surfaces, looking for imperfections, making sure gust locks and things like that were not on and things like that. And then like this one here, there was a form that had to be checked off, and then controls and seats had to be checked, and fuel transfer valves had to be in the off position, and it would go through the whole procedure. Here's the checklist to start the engines, and here's the checklist for engine run up, and before takeoff and after takeoff and before landing and final approach and things like that. So that's why you now have a pilot and co-pilot, and somebody's reading off the checklist and somebody is checking this. And in this particular case, anything marked in red was the pilot's duties to check. Anything marked in black, which doesn't have any red on it, were the co-pilot's duties. Okay? So they would go through and then flip a switch. Okay, it's on, check. It's off, check. It's whatever it may be. So they go, the co-pilot would probably say cabin heat, and the pilot would say off, and then make sure it's off, and generators off, so on and so forth. So this created the checklist, the pre-flight checklist. Every airplane goes through a pre-flight checklist. The pilot goes through a checklist from the the airliners, the fighter jets, the bombers, all the way down to your little Cessnas and your little two-person airplanes. You have to go through a pre-flight checklist to make sure everything is right to go on. Even if you're the only pilot, you still have to go through a checklist to make sure everything is completed. So this led to that. The military made some other small advances in the aviation, but not as much as the other countries were developing and testing. There were conflicts going around the world, and as these conflicts were going on, these other countries were getting more experience in the aviation industry. They were flying airplanes and stuff like that in combat and testing things in combat. The United States was not involved in a lot of these combats, a lot of these conflicts that were going around. So we just made small advances in aviation just based on what we knew around and not having any combat or anything like that. Then at some point in 1938, Germany invaded Austria and Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1939. All of a sudden, something's going on that might be bigger than these little bitty conflicts going around in the rest of the world. And the United States realized that, you know what, we're going to be behind in producing pilots. If something goes and we have to go and help out or help to enter a war or whatever it may be, we're not going to have pilots to do this. So the Army Air Corps saw that if the United States were to do that, we weren't going to be able to train these pilots. Okay, we weren't going to have enough for combat, and again, we were going to be ill prepared for war. Okay, ill prepared. So there is that possibility of war, and on January 12th, 1939, the president gave a message to Congress that basically says we are going to expand the Army Air Corps. Okay, we are going to expand the Army Air Corps. We're going to build up our existing forces throughout the military, but our Army Air Corps is going to be one of them. We're going to increase. There was a limit on number of officers in the United States military at 1,200. They're going to increase the number of officers from 1,200 to 3,203. Okay, so now we have more people in charge, more people in command to make the decisions that need to be made. Okay, war planners were trying to increase pilot training goals, and they were trying to figure out how we could get more pilots trained and more pilots trained. And we also not only had to train pilots, but we had to train other air crew members, bombardiers, people, the bombers, navigators, people that let the planes fly around and guide the planes around, ground technicians, all the ground crew people that were involved in maintaining the airplane and shuttling airplanes around on the runway, and various different other technicians that were on maintenance personnel just on general airplanes and stuff like that. Not only did you have to train the pilots, you had to train the auxiliary members of that aircraft, because one aircraft did not just constitute a pilot. Okay? It constituted many people working together to get that airplane to fly. Okay. So as we continue on, there was problems with training. The Air Corps obviously did not have enough instructors. Okay, we've had very limited experience in World War I. We weren't in it that long. We didn't have any American planes in the war. We had American fighters fighting with other groups, fighting with other countries' airplanes, but we didn't have a lot of aviators in the war. We also did not have the facilities to train these people. We didn't have air bases. Again, what happened at the end of World War I? We scrapped all the air bases. We scrapped all the airplanes. We just let it all go. We didn't have the facilities anymore. We only had a few air bases left. We didn't have a lot of experience, and that goes back to, our our pilots. We didn't have a lot of experienced pilots out there. We weren't in the war that long, so we didn't have a lot of experience out there for flying. So how are they going to fix this problem? Okay, they had multiple problems. How are they going to fix it? One, they were going to turn to civilian flying schools. Remember, after the barnstormers, these flying schools started up. These small corporations started up building airplanes again, so people were getting pilot's license. So they were going to turn to the civilian flying schools, the ones that were giving pilot's license to civilians. Okay, they were looking for them for help. Now, granted, there weren't a lot. They were very limited in numbers, and they were also limited in instructors. Okay, they were limited in aircraft, okay? And they were limited in their facilities or their flying fields. They didn't have a lot of places to fly. Just as an example, the local airfield, not every flying school had their own airfield, and they still to this day don't. You go up to Flying Cloud in Eden Prairie, and there's 3 or 4 flying schools on that airfield. Okay, so it's not like you have an airfield per flying school. You have 3 or 4 flying schools, and if you're putting a couple flying schools on an airfield and you're training military pilots, you're trying to get all these, that's a lot of stuff, moving parts to get around when you're trying to train all these people through different schools, but using the same facilities. There was also not a lot of trained maintenance personnel. Who's going to fix these airplanes when they break? Who's going to fix them when they have issues and things like that? Who's going to make sure that everything runs right? The pilot doesn't know all the ins and outs of the airplane, so you have to have the maintenance personnel to do it. At this time, there was about 23 privately owned flying schools that were actually certified by the Civil Aeronautics Authority. In other words, these flying schools were the only schools that that through that act that were able to license civilian pilots. And if they were able to license civilian pilots, that means their standards were high enough. So that's the standards that they wanted for their Army pilots too. So along with what they had for training facilities, the military, then they had about 23 other flying schools across the United States that they could work through also to get some pilots trained. So they went to some of these contract schools, and their first group was a group of 50 cadets went through. And these 50 cadets, they were the first group that graduated and got through there, and they saw success in what they were doing. So then over the years, they were sending thousands through these contract schools. Okay, there were thousands of pilots that went through these schools and learned to fly. And this was how the United States got around the fact that they didn't have a lot of facilities, a lot of trainers. They turned to the civilian contract schools. The civilian pilot training program gave us a great reserve supply of pilots. So we could get these pilots in the air and get them the basics of flying, get them the license, and then the military could train them in their specific model that they were going to fly in combat flight and or whatever it may be. It also was a great source of national emergency, and that's one of the things that is talked about too. Is one of the great things about with the United States and stuff like that is we have these certain things that we can call upon if need be. I mean, it is one of those things, and it's not to be political or anything, but with the Second Amendment rights, we become the largest unauthorized army in the world. If just by having the hunters in Minnesota and Wisconsin, if they were to call to arms, they would have the largest army in the world, just with the hunters in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So by calling in national emergency, if there is help needed, you have that. And the same thing goes with the pilot trains. All of a sudden we had these pilots that were part of the national fabric that could be called up to be helped if we needed pilots. Okay, so it was a national emergency. And institutions were set up around the country. These institutions to help train pilots. But again, problem is most of these institutions were segregated. So you had white institutions and you had black institutions. And so there was that segregation amongst the army, just like it was in World War One, just like it was in the United States at the time. There was segregation. Couple of the segregated schools that West Virginia Institute was a school for African American pilots to be trained. The Coffee School of Aeronautics was another one. Probably the more famous one that was a segregated school was the Tuskegee Institute that produced the Tuskegee Airmen. And this is a group that actually was a had a prominent part in World War II that was kind of hidden throughout history. But the Tuskegee Airmen and stuff, and the institute they had with trained African American pilots and brought them into the forefront of war and brought them into we can have uh, pilots that are white or black, and they all are doing the same job and doing it just as well as anybody else. So there's some really good movies based on the Tuskegee Institute, but this is kind of where the uh, this part of the war, the inter-year wars, ends because we're kind of pulling right up to the beginning of World War II, and we'll talk more about these groups and things like that in the World War II PowerPoints. But this is just kind of how the developments of aviation happened basically between the end of World War One and prior to the beginning of World War II, late 30s, maybe some into the early 40s of the just prior to World War II. So with that, that ends Chapter 3 PowerPoints and the golden years of aviation.